The research that I'm going to report on today draws on and synthesizes several strands that I've been working on for many years. At the highest and most abstract level, I've been trying to understand change in rapidly developing societies, in particular the dynamic interaction between individuals and larger structures, that is to say the micro-macro link. The societies that I've focused on, mainland China, the PRC, and Taiwan, are particularly interesting in this regard because in both cases you've had authoritarian, one-party Leninist states imposing a set of interlocking institutions from above, and in the Taiwan case, from the outside, over the population, removing or severely restricting individual autonomy and empowerment, and preventing individuals from accumulating the resources that might enable them, should they so desire, to challenge the party state's overwhelming hegemony. So what has been so interesting to observe and to try to understand is how and why individuals have emerged as empowered subjects over time, and how the party states and their institutions have changed and adjusted to this. It's a dialectic, dynamic, ongoing process. To be more specific, the talk that I'm going to give today, which only looks at mainland China, the talk today only looks at mainland China. I'm going to situate 4 particular themes, which I'll talk about in a second, within this larger framework of state-society relations. So what are the 4 themes that I'm going to be dealing with? First is the development of and changes in the economic field. The second is the emergence of private business. The third is the emergence of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. And the fourth is globalization, in particular the role of the internet as a medium linking Chinese society to global society. The empirical case that I'm reporting on here is a San Francisco-based NGO called Wokai that uses the internet to raise money to donate to Chinese NGOs, which then lend the funds to micro-entrepreneurs at the grassroots in 2 remote parts of China. I want to argue that beyond issues of poverty alleviation and provision of goods and services, Wokai is contributing to changing the structure of the economic field in China, as well as social space more generally, particularly through the formation of communities within China, outside China, and between China and global society. Now, an important point that I want to make at the beginning, and Clay said that this talk was going to be somewhat autobiographical, is that my baseline for thinking about China now in 2010 is the fact that I was an exchange student in China beginning in February of 1979. I was in the first group of American exchange students. So in sociology, we talk about the intersection of biography and history. And over the years, I've found very clearly that people's attitudes towards social change or not in China is very deeply influenced by the period of their own life and the period of China's history when they had an extended residence there. So the time that I lived in China was beginning in February of 1979, just 2 months after the start of the reforms, the opening to the outside world and the enlivening of the domestic economy. So this tends to make me, I have to say, this long trajectory happens to make me somewhat more optimistic than many of my colleagues about the direction of change in China towards more openness and possibly respect for what we in the West consider human rights. Now, I try not to be overly Pollyanna-ish. I'm not naive. I don't think I'm that naive. But I do tend to see the glass as at least approaching half full as opposed to half empty. There's nowhere to put my pieces of paper, so I'm just kind of throwing them on the floor here. So every now and then you'll hear a crash, and that's my paper going to the floor. Now, I actually made my first trip to China in 1975. This was at the tail end of Mao Zedong's life and also the very end of the Cultural Revolution. But the Cultural Revolution was still on. When I was there, there was a campaign to enforce all-round dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So for very few people in the room are old enough to remember that. But The talk that I'm giving today on the rise of the bourgeoisie, it's very ironic that I made my first trip to China during one of these periods when there was an attempt to squash whatever elements of individual autonomy, free thinking, to say nothing of private business, was still underway. So my first trip was in 1975, and then I lived for China in a year beginning in February of 1979. From those perspectives, the change in the economic field in China has been nothing short of extraordinary. So what I'm talking about now, first topic, is the economic field. And based on this long 30+ years, the change in China has been absolutely extraordinary in the economic field. When I was in China, it was a collectivized, state-owned, planned, largely self-reliant economy. Now, of course, China has burgeoned into what by most people's estimate is the fastest growing economy in the world, and it has been for many years running. China's economy now is a hybrid, globalized one, which has a sizable private sector and also a very sizable role for direct foreign investment. The Communist Party state, and I'm using that advisedly, the Communist Party state has passed reams of legislation to govern economic activity and to protect private property. China has joined the World Trade Organization and is an active member or partner with numerous trade and investment-oriented international organizations. Now, in thinking about, I've used the term economic field, and in terms of thinking about economic activity, there's this concept in sociology, initially derived from the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, but adapted to very well by my colleague at Berkeley named Neil Fligstein, to the study of business, which is the concept of fields. That if we look at particular aspects of social life, we can think of them in terms of a field like a battlefield or a sports field, where there are different actors, there are different positions, there are different rules, and there are different things that you try to accumulate, if it's points or it's touchdowns or it's runs or one thing or another. So if you think of this metaphor as a field, and we think about the economic field in China, we can see that fields are social constructions. Fields are not something that drops from nature. But these different fields, such as the economic field in China, which is the case I'm looking at, has a history and is malleable. The field has changed. There's competition and collaboration among the players. New players have entered the economic field in China. There are different kinds of regulators or referees or umpires who are enforcing the rules, trying to supervise the play in the field. And the rules themselves change over time. They change as a result of changes within the field, the nature of competition in the field, as well as from different kinds of outside influences. Clearly in China, when we talk about the economic field, the entry of foreign investors, of foreign lenders, traders, consultants, and especially lawyers, has had a significant impact on the economic field. And it has, as has the expansion of the domestic private sector. China's entry into the WTO has also had an impact on changing the rules governing economic behavior within China, and China's playing in the larger global economic field. And here, China's role in outward investment, in outward lending, and outward credit provision also has impacted changes within China, the economic field, as well as now having a major impact on the global economic field. So the first point I want to make, this first theme that I've been looking at, is the economic field in China has undergone dramatic changes. And again, from a sociological point of view, we talk about institutions, which means sets of rules governing behavior in a particular aspect of social life, things that we can take for granted. And the things that we can take for granted in the economic field in China in 2010 are radically different from the things that existed 5 years ago, 10 years ago, to say nothing of 30-some years ago when I was visiting or living in China. The whole idea of taking private enterprise as part of the landscape is revolutionary from the perspective of muddle-headed old reactionary or muddle-headed old Maoists like myself. You'll hear from Rick Baum on April 1st. He'll talk about some of the same things, I think. So I'm trying to stress perhaps too much is the thinking about China, the rapid changes that have taken place and very fundamental changes in the economic field. Now, the second area that I've been researching for a number of years has been the emergence of private business. And again, when I was a student, there was virtually no private enterprise whatsoever. And for me, it's been absolutely astounding observing, first in the early 1980s, the very tentative emergence of small enterprises. And then over the last 20-some years, their expansion, their evolution, their consolidation. Now the emergence of a very visible, a very evident private business class. If we want to call it an entrepreneurial class, we want to call it a bourgeoisie, whatever it is, there is a distinct class of people in China whose social position is based on their own private ownership of the means of production. The rapid expansion of the bourgeoisie took place beginning in the early 1990s, after Deng Xiaoping's trip to the South, where he said, let's get this thing going. Beginning in 1978, the Chinese Communist Party started to permit the reemergence of what in the West we call micro-enterprises. In China, the term is getihu, which literally means individual households. So when we talk about micro-enterprise, that's already something of an exaggeration. I mean, I'm talking about people with a stall selling blue jeans, or usually knockoff Levi's or knockoff Gucci, or Clay mentioned shoe repair, bicycle repair, noodle stands, all kinds of really small stalls and small, very, very small enterprises. These began quite tentatively with changes that the Chinese Communists made in the Constitution beginning in 1978. Why did they do this after spending 30-some years trying to eliminate any vestige of private enterprise? Well, there are a number of reasons. First, 1978, the Cultural Revolution was over, and the government was facing very severe problems of unemployment and underemployment. The economy was relatively stagnant. China still did not have a labor market. Instead, they had the system of fun pay, of allocation of school leavers. When you finished school, you were allocated to a job. You were fun paid to a job. So China, because the economy was was quite stagnant, there were fewer and fewer openings, and these state-owned enterprises and collective enterprises were increasingly unwilling to absorb the school leavers. So China officially at that time did not have unemployment. Instead, what they had was waiting for work, or 待业. So when I was a student in 1979, we would go around and say, do you have a problem with unemployment? Say, oh no, there's no unemployment in China. We do, however, have several tens of millions of people waiting for work. And so it was referred to as invisible unemployment. But there was this, so that the problem of all of these young people leaving school and not having jobs was one of the motivating factors behind permitting the reemergence of small-scale entrepreneurship. Related to that was fears of social unrest, because in addition to the young people graduating from middle school who did not have jobs, you also had hundreds of thousands or millions of former Red Guards and rusticated youths coming back to the city. During the period of the Cultural Revolution, an estimated 17 million high school leavers, people finishing middle school or high school, voluntarily went to the countryside or the mountains to settle for life. But by the late 1970s, they could sense that that policy was over, and they started to return to the cities. So again, when I was living in Shanghai, suddenly you saw all of these mostly young men hanging out on street corners who had come back from the cities, and the government said, you volunteered to spend the rest of your life there. We don't owe you anything. We don't owe you a job. You're not even waiting for work because you're not part of the fund pay system. You don't have an urban residence permit. So you had tens of thousands, in Shanghai alone, of these young people hanging out with nothing to do. And a number of them had been former Red Guards, so they were used to beating and looting and making revolution and so on. So the government was really worried that these young people with a history of making trouble when there was no outlet for them and they were not about to go back to the countryside also posed a threat. And the third motivating factor behind permitting the reemergence of a private sector was the really dismal quality of life in China's urban areas. A city like Shanghai, now we think of the glittering metropolis and so on, but at that time, 1979, Shanghai was really a dump. There's no nicer word that you didn't. There had been no maintenance, there had been no new building going on. It was really in very, very sad state of disrepair. Plus, there were in terms of services, if you wanted to get something done, if you wanted to go go out for the evening, if you wanted to go to a restaurant or go to get a snack, all of these, go to a movie, go to a play, all of these things were extremely limited, extremely difficult to do. So people were quite dissatisfied with the quality of life. Not only the nature of their own lives, but as they became more and more aware of what had gone on over the previous 20 years in the Chinese societies of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore, as well as the culturally related societies of Japan and South Korea, they became increasingly frustrated. Why is it that China, under the leadership of the Communist Party, has fallen so far behind all of these other countries or societies in East Asia? So from the Communist Party's perspective, permitting small-scale micro-entrepreneurs, the gutihu, could solve a number of problems. It could absorb a lot of these unemployed people. It could absorb a lot of these people coming back from the countryside to whom the government did not owe any job. And also, by providing goods and services, it could satisfy a lot of the pent-up demand on the part of urban residents and make their lives happier. And also, setting up these private enterprises would cost the state nothing. And if they were taxed properly, it could provide some revenues for the state. It could stimulate consumption, stimulate the domestic market, people working in private business, as it happened elsewhere in East Asia, becoming increasingly busy with making money, less inclined to think about politics or other kinds of issues of social inequality. So over the years, the state has written a number of laws and regulations. It has amended the Constitution. It has sold off state enterprises and collectives. It has made inequality in consumption desirable motivators. You probably know the phrase, to get rich is glorious. So in all these ways, the Communist Party state has helped to legitimize private business and, very ironically, has gone out of its way to create a good investment climate for local private business as well as for foreign investors. The private sector has expanded beyond these gutihu with a limit of 7 employees to now you have private enterprises in China which have tens of thousands of employees, many of whom have bought up state enterprises, many of whom are investing abroad now. And so that the scope and scale of the private sector and of China's bourgeoisie has expanded quite dramatically. However, one recurring problem has been the inability of these micro enterprises to get funds for startup or for working capital. They need to rely on their family, their friends, or their guanxi networks, their social connections. Or they have to turn to usurious moneylenders or pawn shops in order to get startup capital. So even though banks are lending to private enterprises, they're not lending to micro entrepreneurs. They're not lending to these people who want to start up an enterprise. They have to rely on these other sources. Here, 2 things have begun to change. The state has begun to permit foreign lenders and local investors to set up village banks. But a lack of access to credit remains a major problem for micro enterprises. Now, in my study of private business, I'm looking not only empirically at the emergence of this bourgeoisie, but I'm also quite interested in private business as an indicator of privacy more generally. Again, when I was living in China, I hate to keep personalizing this, but again, that's the way I think about things. Private life, a private sphere, and individual autonomy was quite restricted, quite illegitimate. But now, again, watching China over the last 30 years, one of the things that's been so clear has been the expansion of private space, of the empowerment of the individual. Increased scope for individual autonomy, for people taking control over their own lives. When 30 years ago, the Communist Party enforced passivity. People were not supposed to think for themselves. You could not look for a job. You could not start a business. You could not arrange your own career, where you lived, where you're married, if you got married, who you married, how long you stayed in school. All of these things were decided for you. So the fact now that more and more aspects of social life are up to the individual to arrange and to set for him or herself is, I think, a very significant development. Now, the third area that I've been looking at for the last few years is that of the rise of NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. I've worked with a number of NGOs. In America, we more commonly call them nonprofits. But I've worked with a number of NGOs over the years in the United States, most of which, virtually all of which, have something to do with China. Last fall, I taught an undergraduate seminar at Berkeley, where the students volunteered with one of 5 NGOs based in Oakland or Berkeley, working with the Oakland public school system to help create new avenues of access to higher education for students of Oakland public schools, trying to give young kids the idea that you too can get in a higher education, how you prepare for it, providing scholarships, providing mentors. And so my work with that organization, as well as with these other NGOs, in particular thinking about startup NGOs, one of the things that I enjoy doing and that we did in this class last fall was stepping back and looking at the whole process of the establishment of an NGO. What is the vision? Where does somebody get a vision for setting up a nonprofit, setting up an organization? What we talk about social entrepreneurship. It's a big buzzword now. This idea of where do social entrepreneurs come from? How do they get the vision about setting up some kind of a nonprofit, some sort of an NGO? Once they have a vision, how do they translate that into a mission statement? How do they get other people on board behind their vision to support their mission statement to form an organization? How do they raise money to support the organization? How do they go about achieving their goals? How do they expand? How do they sustain themselves over time? So this kind of social entrepreneurship is vital to American life. It's fundamental to American life. And as de Tocqueville wrote almost 200 years ago, one of the strongest, most characteristic aspects of America as a people and America as a nation is social entrepreneurship, is our getting involved, our volunteering, our setting up organizations to address issues in social or political life. Now, in mainland China, for most of the first 4 decades of the PRC's existence, all organizations had to be established and run by the Communist Party and or the state. There was no space for autonomous organizations, which are the foundation of civil society. If we want to talk about a realm between disorganized society and the state, and we want to call it civil society, foundation of that is the ability to organize to set up autonomous organizations. In China, this space had been eradicated, and the Communist Party did everything it could to prevent its reemergence. In 1989, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, you saw the emergence of autonomous organizations, starting, say, with Solidarity in Poland. That was actually from the early 1980s. But you saw the emergence of this sphere of civil society. In 1987, you had democratic transition. 1986, democratic transition in South Korea. 1983, actually, in the Philippines. Anyway, on that period of time. 1986, the Philippines. 1987, South Korea. 1987, Taiwan. So it was even in China's backyard. And then seeing what was going on in Eastern Europe, the Communist Party became even more fearful of what subsequently we call color revolutions, but the emergence of civil society. In 1988 and 1989 in China, there were a number of so-called autonomous organizations, 自治, self-administered organizations, such as students and farmers and workers and journalists and other kinds of professionals emerging in Beijing and elsewhere and throughout China. With the Tiananmen crackdown, the Communist Party indicated it was not going to tolerate this kind of development. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, it became even more adamant about preventing the emergence of a civil society which might challenge the hegemony of the Communist Party state. Nonetheless, in recent years, there has been the emergence of a nonprofit NGO sector in China. Its existence is still quite tenuous. It's mistrusted by the party state. The legal infrastructure legitimizing and protecting NGOs is very, very weak and arbitrary. But here, too, I would argue a field is taking shape. There is the emergence of a distinct field in Chinese social life of NGOs. Now, just before I came, I was reading my email, and there was an article in the South China Morning Post from Hong Kong tomorrow. It's already the 12th there, about the Chinese government cracking down on Chinese NGOs receiving foreign assistance. And the main case they cited was of an HIV/AIDS organization, but there are others in sensitive areas like legal aid, like labor, and so on, which are quite always walking a very fine line in China. So that the status of these NGOs is still quite tenuous, quite iffy. But nonetheless, I think that you really can see the emergence of a distinct field of NGOs in China. Now, the strongest Chinese NGOs are not what we would actually recognize as NGOs, as non-governmental organizations. They are government-organized non-governmental organizations, or Ngos, which of course is an oxymoron. But many people have noted in research that these Ngos, given the chance, often do stand up for the interests of the people they supposedly represent. So even though we certainly should approach this idea of NGOs in China with a certain dose of healthy skepticism, there really is something going on there, both in the Ngo area and in what we would really call real non-governmental organizations. At Beijing University and at Tsinghua University, there are centers for the study of, at Tsinghua the study of NGOs, and at Beida the study of civil society. So while in the West it looked like civil society in China was a dead issue, actually something has been happening on the ground in China, and China's two premier Beijing-located universities are engaged in research on this phenomenon that they too have seen emerging. Now, the fourth topic that I've been looking at is globalization. This, of course, by its nature, is a huge topic. I already mentioned China's integration into the global economy, where it's now a major player, and the role of direct foreign investment in China, and now China's own foreign investment and activity in the global economy. My interest recently has turned to the role of international NGOs, or Ngos. There's a whole litany of jargon here, of Ngos in China. In particular, I've been studying an environmental, or Ngo, based in San Francisco, called Pacific Environment, which works with grassroots environmental activists in China and Russia to help them enhance their capacity to identify issues, to publicize them, to mobilize activism, and to build coalitions with officials, scientists, the media, students, and citizenry at large to address issues related to the environment in China, and at the same time to integrate them into global environmental movement and global civil society. Now, another aspect of Pacific environment, beside the sort of the global NGO involvement in China, has been the role of the internet. Now, in the last couple of weeks, there's been this flap over Google and Google's behavior in China and Google's threat to pull out of China. But it indicates the spread of the internet within China. There's an estimated, 350 million people who log onto the internet on a regular basis within China. Now, most of them are teenage boys playing violent games. But there's some of them also who are actually looking for sources of information and are participating in various kinds of the blogosphere, the Chinese blogosphere and the global blogosphere. Now, the Chinese government keeps responding by building and then raising the height of the Great Firewall of China. But the fact that they have to keep doing this indicates that there are more and more people who are figuring out ways to leap over it or dig holes in it or go around it in order to be able to access the World Wide Web. Pacific Environment uses the internet quite effectively in its work, but that's another talk. I'm not going to talk about Pacific Environment today. Okay, now finally we can get to the case that I want to use to illustrate these four themes that I've been working on. I think it helps to draw them together. It's another NGO, it's another San Francisco-based NGO called Wokai. Wokai lends money to private micro-entrepreneurs in China via Chinese NGOs, or they're actually Chinese Ngos, utilizing the internet. So that Wokai sends money to China, raised in the United States or elsewhere in the world, raised outside of China and sometimes in China now, to Chinese NGOs, which then lend it to micro-entrepreneurs. We'll see more when I turn on the screen. Now, just as a methodological note, most of my research over the years has been based on interviews and participant observation. My involvement with Wokai has been on a number of different levels. I know the two founders. One of them was a student at Berkeley, and she told me about her vision when she wanted to set up this organization with a friend of hers. I hosted a house party for them. I have paid a research visit to one of the field sites and interviewed the Gongo and interviewed several of the micro-entrepreneurs. I've interviewed the founders on a number of occasions, both in person and as I develop this project, I keep badgering them with questions. So I'm hardly a detached observer. I think this is a great organization, and I'm not here today to sell it, but I think it is a great organization. But I'm using it. I'm trying to detach myself, to step back from the organization itself, to try to draw out some larger themes about what I see is going on in China. Now, before I log onto the site, if you'll bear with me for one more minute, I want to say a few words about microcredit or microfinance. This has become a huge topic in sociology, economics, finance, the development field. The father of microfinance, the Bangladeshi economist Muhammad Yunus, won the 2006 Nobel Peace Prize, honoring his efforts in building microfinance primarily through the organization he set up, the Grameen Bank. He established it in 1976. The Nobel Peace Prize certainly gives the stamp of approval or the hope, wishful thinking to people who are doing something good for humanity. Now, technically, there's a difference between microcredit and microfinance, though usually the two terms are used interchangeably. Microcredit refers to small loans to borrowers who usually have no collateral or access to formal lenders. So they rely on or exploited by usurers. Microfinance includes that, plus other services like taking deposits, selling insurance, and transferring money. So we talk about MFIs, microfinance institutions, which are involved in lending the money and, in some cases, providing these other kinds of services. There are for-profit and non-profit microfinance institutions. And in the world today, we see one of the areas of growth in the international global civil society has been the rise and expansion of, in particular, non-profit-oriented microfinance institutions. And there is a debate over the real ability of these MFIs to alleviate poverty, whether they actually will help these organizations become these enterprises become sustainable. Whether the MFIs or the people they lend to are efficient. What are the questions of efficiency of lending money to these very small enterprises? Accountability on the part of the recipients, of transparency, and of course corruption. If you're lending to either an NGO in another country or you're lending to one of these micro-entrepreneurs, how much accountability is there? How can you tell what's really going on? How can you avoid corruption? So there's a lot of skepticism about all of microfinance. Most of what you read is very, very positive, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands that there's a lot of criticism about it as well. I myself think it's really exciting, and from studying from the perspective of looking at these micro-entrepreneurs in China and their inability to get capital and comparable to micro-entrepreneurs around the world, I think this whole rise of a microfinance sector is really exciting and fulfills a very important need. Now, Wokai utilizes two models in its operation. One is the Grameen Bank, which was established by Muhammad Yunus in 1976. Grameen is a Bengali word which means rural or village. One key to the Grameen model, G-R-A-M-E-E-N, it's not just about lending money, but it also has an important social element. I think this is one of the reasons he won the Nobel Peace Prize, is that it's focused on women. And most societies are paternalistic, male-dominated, but Bangladeshi or Bengali society apparently is particularly male-dominated. And women are severely restricted in their ability to leave the home, to have an independent life, to engage in any sort of business, to accumulate any kind of resources. They just are baby machines, doing housework. So there's a lot of problems with the status of women. So Yunus focused his lending on women, rural women in Bangladesh. It's not only providing them money to start up enterprises, but also he organizes the women into mutual responsibility groups. So each woman gets a loan, her own individual loan, and then the groups get together, I think on about a weekly basis, and there's a ritual where they pay off some of their loan every week, and it's written in a book and stamped. So there's this ritualized aspect. But in addition, because of the low literacy rate in Bangladesh, one of the things that the Grameen Bank does is it makes women literate. It trains them in literacy. It talks about public health and family planning and child rearing and basic economic and business knowledge. So it's a whole package. It's a very comprehensive kind of approach. The other organization that Wokai draws on is called Kiva, K-I-V-A. Kiva is another Bay Area-based NGO focused on microfinance. What Kiva does is collect money from donors in the Bay Area, I mean anywhere. It collects money from donors. It then sends the money to NGOs around the world. Kiva is not in China. They do not operate in China. But they transfer the money to NGOs in developing countries who then lend the money to micro-entrepreneurs. And they don't give it away. I mean, they lend it at interest. Then the micro-entrepreneurs pay the money back to the NGO. As a donor to Kiva, if you want, once the loan is repaid, you can get your money back. So you are lending money to Kiva. Or you can donate money to Kiva. So what Wokai does is combine Grameen Bank's focus primarily on women, rural, also mutual responsibility. China, the literacy issue is not as great, and the family planning issue is not as great, but still basic financial literacy, other kinds of skills, training these women, plus Kiva. Oh, I forgot to mention, of course, key to Kiva is that it's based on the internet. It's all based on the internet, is what you see. Kiva posts profiles of a whole range of potential borrowers with their stories. And then you, as a donor or a lender, pick one recipient who you would like to receive your donation or your loan. It's all based on the internet. And you can track the progress of your borrower and so on. So it's all based on the internet. It's all a virtual, completely virtual operation. Now, may I have the projector, please? Ta-da. Okay, here we are. This is the homepage of Wokai. So we can see it highlights, I mean, here's all the various tabs, most of which we'll go through. But front and center, and this is the Kiva model, is a profile of a possible borrower, someone who you, if you so decide, can direct your donation to. And here's how much the person wants, here's how much they've got before. And here are some of the issues. Now I want to point out, how does Wokai work? First of all, it's educational. What is microfinance? So you can get a lot of the things that I just talked about quite sketchily by reading the website. How does Wokai work? In recent weeks, recent months, there was some sustained criticism of Kiva in the Wall Street Journal, reported in the Wall Street Journal. New York Times had an article about it. And Wokai immediately rose to answer those critiques, which were directed at Kiva, to say, here's how we are avoiding the sort of problems and criticism that Kiva is undergoing. Okay, now we've looked at the homepage. Now we're going to look at About. Okay, so this may be a little bit small. So Wokai, oh, the characters didn't come out, but Wokai means I begin or I open an enterprise. It refers to and there's a typo here which I have to tell them to change the web page. It refers to the opportunity that our organization provides to Chinese micro-entrepreneurs to start small businesses, start changing their own lives, and lift themselves and their families out of poverty. So it's the entrepreneurial aspect and the welfare aspect of lifting poverty alleviation. Wokai was founded in the spring of 2007 by Casey Wilson and Courtney McColgan, two young women who met while studying Chinese at Tsinghua University. Now I have to put in a plug here. They were studying at the program that I run at Tsinghua University, the Inter-University Program for Chinese Language Studies, IUP, and if you want to apply for it, you can talk to me later. They met while they were there. Casey was an undergraduate at Wesleyan University who lives in Oakland. She's from Oakland. Courtney is from Southern California and is a Cal graduate. She was never in a class of mine, but she came to see me one day, said, I'm an econ major, but I heard that you study private business in China. I've worked at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and the small-scale rural, for Du Xiaoshan, it's the microfinance unit. I've done a lot of research on this. I'm interested in doing some more work along these lines. And then it turned out that Casey and Courtney met at IUP, and while they were there, they discovered that they both had an interest in development, in helping women, in alleviating poverty, and in microfinance. So ta-da, I'm sort of their matchmaker. In their travels between rural and urban China, they, Casey and Courtney, witnessed the injustice of China's burgeoning income gap. Microfinance offered a solution, empowering the poor to work their way towards financial independence with as small as $150. Here's another typo. As small as a loan as $150. A borrower can start her own business, accumulate savings, and eventually earn a stable income to pay for education, healthcare, and other services. Moved by the cause, they decided to commit their lives to augmenting this type of positive change in China. So before, when I talked about setting up an NGO, that somebody has a vision, and then how do you translate your vision into a mission statement? And then how do you build an organization around it? This is a very good case, a very good example of that. These are two people who had a vision. They saw a need out there. They had a vision. They wanted to create some sort of an organization in order they stated a mission in order to achieve their goals. So it's a very good case of the establishment of a nonprofit. Wokai today. I realize people have class. Wokai is a 501c3 nonprofit with offices in Oakland, California, and Beijing, China. Since launching our website in 2008, Wokai has already raised over $140,000 and contributed loan capital and empowered over 270 borrowers in China to start small businesses. Wokai has launched 2 field partners, which we'll look at in a minute, in Inner Mongolia and rural Sichuan, and has built a global community of over 1,000 contributors, 6 flagship chapters in Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai, San Francisco, Seattle, and New York, 150 volunteers worldwide, and a core team in Beijing and California. We've also received tremendous media success. Okay, so that is basically the Wokai story. Now, Wokai is a 501c3 nonprofit. It is unlike Kiva. It is purely based on donations. You do not expect at the end of the cycle, when your loan is repaid, that you will get the money back. You have donated the money. It's gone. It's gone as a donation. Okay, now we want to look at how Wokai works. So if you're more interested in this, you can watch this 36-minute video, which we don't have time for right now. However, we will watch a 1-minute video. Is there sound on this? Oh, how do I raise it?
Your speakers on your computer, though.
Oh, shoot. Well, okay, forget about it. What it is, it's Casey talking about, it's okay, we don't have to do it. It's Casey talking about how, obviously, how Wokai works. It's the fact that we can look at the tabs down here. Oh, it's still going anyway. Wokai has selected 2 field partners, who I'll introduce in a minute, in China. And it conducts constant due diligence over these field partners as well as the micro-entrepreneurs, so that any questions about accountability, transparency, and corruption, it's on the case. It's trying to make sure that there is no funny business going on once the money goes from the donors outside of China to the local gongo, and then from the gongo on to the micro-entrepreneurs. The field part, so you donate money to Wokai. Wokai then sends the money to China to one of two field partners. The field partners screen and select recipients in their local communities and then post the profiles of the borrowers on the website. Well, I've jumped ahead because Wokai selected the field partners. The field partners post the profiles. The contributors like you browse through their profiles and make tax-deductible donations. Then Wokai distributes the money to the field partner, which then lends the money from anywhere from 12 to 20% interest. It's not interest-free. It's less than a usurer would charge, but more than a bank would charge, but these people can't get bank loans. So this is an opportunity they would not otherwise have. The field partner collects the loan repayments and sends updates to Wokai about their progress. Once the loan is fully repaid, contributors may reinvest their contributions to help fund a new recipient's loan, and so on and so forth. Okay, now let's look at the field partners. Field partner is the Chinese Ngos who receives the donations sent by donors to Wokai. There are two of them. Oh, I should show you first here where the two field sites where Wokai operates. One is here in a place called Chifeng, Inner Mongolia. Chifeng, Inner Mongolia. It's a rural, very poor area of Inner Mongolia on the Liaoning, the border of Liaoning province, dominated primarily by people of the Mongol nationality. So it's a minority region. The other is down here in Yilong County, Sichuan province. I have been to Chifeng, I have not been to Yilong. But apparently Chifeng, there's an airport. And it's on the train, the train. But Yilong is apparently quite remote and quite difficult to get to. So the two Ngos who receive the money, the one in Chifeng is part of the Women's Federation. The one in Yilong, in Sichuan, it's a different kind of a Ngo focused exclusively on rural development. Both of these Ngos were set up by the UN Development Program, the UNDP, in the 1990s. Now, Courtney and Casey, when they got this idea of what they wanted to do, they went around and looked at 4 potential sites. And they interviewed 4 of these Ngos in China and then decided that the one in Chifeng and the one in Yilong were the ones that they wanted to start with. Their goal is to expand their operation, to expand their partners. But they selected these 2 as their first partners. Okay, so that is, those are the 2 field partners and where they are. And here, if you want more details about how they identify the field partners, how they evaluate them, approve them, and monitor them, you can read that. And when I went with Casey and this fellow here, Zhang Sheng, who is the paid employee in Beijing, when I went with them to Chifeng, we stopped off first at the Women's Federation organization here. And Casey and Zhang Sheng went through their accounts. They closely monitored what they were doing. Now the Chinese, not unexpectedly, were a bit annoyed about these people opening their books and looking through them. But the payoff is that this means that Wokai can confidently say these are reliable organizations. You can trust that the money you lend to them will go where it's supposed to go, so that we are constantly monitoring them. Okay, now, Wokai operates, they use the term team. So the team, first of all, is the team, Casey right here, and the other people who are involved in the staff, which is small, Zhang Sheng based in Beijing. But mostly they rely on volunteers, on interns. And if any of you students are interested in interning, volunteering with Wokai in Beijing, let me know. They've got a very small board of directors just set up. They've got an investment committee. This woman, Maya Chorengel, is a real expert in microfinance based in Silicon Valley. She's an extraordinarily impressive person. Then there are these chapters. There are these 6 chapters. And these are the people who, are the presidents of each of these chapters, and you can read their bios. And then at the bottom, you can see who the official members of these chapters are. And the chapters meet on a regular basis. They talk about the profiles, and they decide who they want to donate money, who they want to identify as their loan recipients. And you could see through this concept of teams and of chapters that they're really trying to build a sense of community. That Wokai is not just about lending money, but it's about building these communities, these chapters of people who are engaged in this activity. Now, and they personalize, so everything is quite personalized. Now, let's look at loans pending. Here we can see a selection of some of the recipients. And these are just introductions to their profiles. You can get more and you can see how much they've requested. And these are really not a huge amount of money. I mean, they're small amounts of money in our terms. You can see how much they've requested and how far along they are on the road to getting their loans. Now, this one here, okay, let's look at her. She's the one who's the featured borrower of the month. My name is Sechingerle. That's, I mean, it's some sort of Mongol name. I'm 33 years old with a family of 3. I have an adorable spirited daughter named Narenjuge, who is currently in primary school. I've been making microloans for 6 years and use this money every year to take care of my family's cattle. So she's in cattle rearing. With the help of microfinance in the past 6 years, I've been successful in animal husbandry. Now, we not only own cattle, we also own over 10 horses. Last year's drought resulted in grassless fields, snow, and frost, and we encountered many snowstorms during winter this year. The price of grass and feed has doubled in cost, and I've heard that in many places, livestock is either starved to death or frozen to death. Even though my family's already prepared all our grass and feed for the winter, we still don't have enough. That's why I'm applying to make a 4,000 yuan note so that I can buy enough grass and feed to minimize the loss of our livestock. So there's an example of a profile. And you can see from the profile that it's a combination of two things. One is a hardship case. I am in a very difficult position. I need a loan. The other is her efforts to raise herself out of poverty. So these are two very compelling American stories. One is the hardship story, but the other is the story about the bootstrap story, how I'm helping myself. I'm not asking you for a handout. I'm asking you for a leg up so that I can take care of myself, take care of my family, improve our life, improve the life of my adorable spirited daughter who's in primary school so that she can then go on to college. So you can see that there's this kind of story which Americans love, of somebody who is not asking for a handout, they're asking for temporary assistance. Now, let's look now at community. Here, yeah, Eric?
I don't mean to interrupt. Could I just very quickly ask, this is loans pending, but were you saying earlier that these were not loans, that essentially the person who's putting the money in is donating the money? Because I'm getting kind of conflicting nomenclature here.
If you make a loan to Wokai, and you can see on the page here, you can select a person, an industry, you can select a person and so on, you can select a type, you can, the My Cart, gift card, you can donate money. So depending on if it's in Chifeng, Inner Mongolia or in Yilong, Sichuan, your money will go to those two Ngos. Then you will have also selected one of the profiled borrowers as your recipient.
I understand all that, but it's loan.
It's a loan. You donate the money, but the money is lent to them. It's a loan that they pay back with interest.
It's a donation to
but it's not a loan,
the NGO.
Is it paid, but so I'm making a donation then,
To the NGO.
So I'm not making a loan.
No, you're making a donation. So
Okay.
you can write it off as a tax donation.
Because,
Yeah.
you know,
But so that
language,
yeah.
I'm trying to parse the language quite carefully.
Sorry. So the Kiva is different. In the Kiva, at the end, you could say, I want my money back, and then it's not a donation. But with Wokai, it's 100% a donation. Okay, now I wanted to look at community. I wanted to look at, we're looking at recipients. Now I wanted to look at, okay, so the community is, oh no, these are the ones we looked at already. I want to look at community. It's not going to be yeah. Okay, so these are recipients. I'm sorry, donors. These are examples of people who have donated money to Wokai. Now, because this is LA, let's look at the film distributor. Now, he doesn't say anything about himself except that he's a Beijing-based film distributor. But here are the 5 people he has selected as his loans recipients. Now, his donations recipients. Now, let's look at her. Now, if we want to see her profile, we could get her profile, which is down here. I won't take the time to read it. But the interesting thing is that we see updates of her activities with the loans that she has received so far up to last October. Up to last October. We get a lot of details here on the NGO, on the Gongo. We get activities on this particular borrower. I'm sorry, yeah, she's borrowed money that has been donated by foreigners, by outsiders. Now, if we look on her page, we can see other people who have selected her as their recipient also. So let's look at Phil R. Now, Phil has a statement. Come on, Phil. Come on, Phil. Phil is being, he was there before. Phil. All right, well, uh-oh, it looks like we're frozen. It's the story of my life. Okay, well, anyway, Phil talks about why he gives. And it feels, oh, here we go. The interesting thing about Phil is, I want to see others have a chance to elevate. This isn't about charity, it's about creating opportunity. That, again, is a very compelling American story. It's workfare, not welfare. I'm making funds available so that this woman can bring herself and her family out of poverty. So anyway, you can just see how this whole thing works here. Now, the recipients know that the money that they are borrowing comes in the first place from foreigners. But they do not know who the foreigners are. They do not themselves have access to the web. So when I asked Casey about this, she said that they're working on 2 things. One is a bilingual website. The website now is only in English, so all of this has to be translated. So if you want to volunteer there as an intern, one of the things that you would probably do is to translate some of these profiles and these updates into English to post on the website. So they want to develop Chinese language website because they also want to cultivate a community of donors within China. The other thing they're trying to do, the other thing they want to do is to eventually make sure that these borrowers have computer access so that they themselves can be more integrated into this larger community. Okay, so that is what I wanted to look at. Now, just by way of conclusion, this is only one case. It's hard to make grand generalizations based on one case. But when I talked about the 4 areas that I've been working on for a number of years, I think Wokai really helps to illustrate a number of very interesting points. First of all, that there is this process in China right now of poverty alleviation and of an improved standard of living. The figure that the Chinese often give, that is often given, is that over the course of the reforms, the Chinese government has brought 300 million people out of poverty. These 2 places, Chifeng and Yilong, are poverty areas. But what we see here are cases of improved standard of living and of optimism about continued improved standard of living. That once I get my enterprise going, I have a chance of not only improving my standard of living, but also that of my single child, or one of the women has twins. And when I visited the homes of some of these people, these 2 of these, now they possibly were selected for me because they were model cases. But nonetheless, these 2 women were both dairy farmers. They had a bunch of cattle. And they had built new homes, they had electricity, they had running water. They had VCRs, their kids had video games, they had vehicles, motorized vehicles, using like tractors or a small truck for moving goods and so on. They had, they had tile floors. They had, in one house, they had a methane what do you call it, a methane collecting thing for generating electricity. So it was very green as well. So in terms of poverty alleviation and improved standard of living, this appears to have, this Wokai model in only a short period of existence has had some payoff. Second, we see the continued emergence of an entrepreneurial class. These are people who were dirt poor farmers, but now they are accumulating resources, they have a stake in the system, they're improving their standards of living, and they're, in most cases, planning on expanding their enterprise somewhat. These are not people who are trying to build, I don't think they have visions of building grand enterprises, as most entrepreneurs do not, but they're planning on building sustainable enterprises over time. Third, individual empowerment. Certainly when I talked to these people, they were able to and I don't know how much they had been rehearsed. They didn't seem to be rehearsed, but they were able to articulate their life experiences, their life stories, that they felt empowered, they now had wealth, they understood a whole lot more about the outside world. There were foreigners who were coming to their farm. There was a sense that now they had much more control over their own life course. Fourth, we can see through this the linkage of the global and the local, and I mean really local. These people are really at the literal grassroots of society, and that it is being mediated through new technology. That the internet has made it possible for those of us here to have, it's still a virtual connection, but it might even become a real physical connection to these dairy farmers and these small shop owners and these other kinds of micro-entrepreneurs in remote parts of China. Fifth, that the activities and rules in the economic field continue to change. You've got these Ngos, you've got foreign donors, you've got foreign NGOs who are now active players in the economic field in China. And fifth, and again, which I find is one of the most significant things, is this process of community building. That within China you have these mutual responsibility groups, but then you've got these mutual responsibility groups and these sense of people as belonging to communities of borrowers. But then you've also got now these foreign teams, these foreign chapters who meet, and they meet around their common interest in supporting microfinance in China. And then you've got this larger global level, still virtual community that's being built between the donors and supporters of Wokai, the NGOs, the Ngos in China, and the people borrowing at the grassroots. So that's the end of my formal presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.